The day you stop explaining yourself to people who were never trying to understand you, is the day your entire life changes. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that nobody talks about. Not the exhaustion of hard work. Not the exhaustion of long hours or physical effort or the beautiful tiredness that follows a day of genuine, purposeful output. This is a different kind. Quieter. More corrosive. The exhaustion of spending enormous amounts of your mental and emotional energy trying to make people understand you. Trying to justify your decisions. Trying to defend your choices to people who have already decided how they feel about them. Trying to explain yourself, again, and again, and again, to people who were never actually listening. You know this exhaustion. I know you do. Because you have been in the middle of a sentence, some long, carefully constructed explanation of why you did what you did, why you need what you need, why your choice makes sense, and felt, somewhere in your chest, the hollow recognition that it isn't working. That the other person's expression hasn't changed. That the words are falling into a space that was never open to receiving them. And yet you kept talking. Because somewhere along the way, you developed a belief so deeply embedded that it feels like common sense. If I just explain it clearly enough, they will understand. And if they understand, everything will be okay. This belief is costing you everything. Not because explanation is wrong. Not because clarity is overrated. Not because communication doesn't matter. But because there is a profound difference between explaining yourself to someone who is genuinely open to understanding, and explaining yourself to someone who has already made up their mind. Who is using your explanation not as information but as ammunition. Who interprets your justification not as honesty but as confirmation of exactly what they already believed about you. And until you learn to tell the difference, and respond to each situation accordingly, you will spend an enormous portion of your life energy talking into walls and wondering why nothing ever changes. There was a man named Samuel who was brilliant at his work. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly brilliant. His instincts were sharp, his judgment was sound, and the results of his decisions consistently proved him right. But Samuel had a habit. Every decision he made, he explained. To his team. To his peers. To his superiors. To anyone who raised an eyebrow or asked a question or even seemed mildly uncertain about his direction. He would launch into detailed, thorough, meticulously constructed explanations of his reasoning. The context. The factors he had weighed. The alternatives he had considered. The logic that had led him to this particular conclusion. He thought this made him look thoughtful. Collaborative. Transparent. What it actually made him look was uncertain. Because here is something Samuel didn't understand, something that took him years and a significant amount of professional pain to learn. When you over-explain a decision, you don't communicate confidence. You communicate doubt. You signal to every person listening that you are not entirely sure the decision was right, and that you need their agreement in order to feel certain. You invite debate where there should be none. You open negotiations that were already closed. You hand people the very lever they need to move you, and then seem surprised when they use it. Samuel's brilliance was never in question. But his authority, his ability to lead, to be trusted with increasing responsibility, to move through his professional world with the kind of quiet power that opens doors, was being quietly undermined every time he opened his mouth to justify what he had already decided. The day his mentor pulled him aside and said, "Samuel, a confident decision needs no paragraph," was the day everything began to shift. Let us talk about why we over-explain. Because understanding the root of a pattern is the first step toward genuinely dismantling it, and this particular root goes deeper than most people realize. For most people, the compulsion to explain themselves begins in childhood. In environments where love or approval was conditional, where the wrong decision meant withdrawal of warmth, where making a choice that disappointed someone meant facing anger or silence or the particular cruelty of being made to feel guilty for having needs, children learn very quickly that explanation is survival. If I can just explain myself well enough, if I can make them understand that I didn't mean to disappoint them, that I had a good reason, that I am still worthy of their approval, then everything will be okay. That strategy made sense then. In a child's world, where the approval of the adults around you is genuinely connected to your safety and well-being, finding the words that restore the relationship is not weakness. It is wisdom. The problem is that most of us carry that strategy into our adult lives, into professional relationships, into friendships, into dynamics that have nothing in common with the childhood situation that produced the reflex, and we apply it indiscriminately. We explain ourselves to bosses who are not our parents. To colleagues who are not threatening our safety. To friends whose momentary disapproval is not a crisis. To strangers whose opinions of our choices have absolutely no bearing on the quality of our lives. We apply a childhood survival strategy to adult situations that do not require survival. And in doing so, we shrink. We hand over authority. We make ourselves smaller than we are in order to manage the comfort of people who were never, in the first place, entitled to our explanations. Epictetus understood something about this with the precision of someone who had been forced, by the most extreme circumstances imaginable, to locate his sense of self entirely within himself. He wrote, "Never explain yourself to anyone. A person who likes you doesn't need it. A person who doesn't like you won't believe it." Read that again. Slowly. A person who likes you doesn't need it. A person who doesn't like you won't believe it. In 2 sentences, Epictetus dismantled the entire architecture of the over-explanation compulsion. Because if those 2 things are true, and they are, observably, consistently, across every kind of relationship, then what, exactly, is the explanation for? There is a woman named Adise who spent the first 38 years of her life explaining herself to her family. Every choice she made, her career path, her relationship decisions, the city she chose to live in, the friends she kept, the way she spent her money and her time, she brought to her family with an explanation attached. Sometimes a short one. Often a very long one. Always infused with the unspoken hope that this time, this explanation, would be the one that finally produced understanding. Acceptance. The quiet, liberating experience of being known and approved of by the people whose approval she had been seeking since she was old enough to want it. It never came. Not because her family were villains. They were not. They were simply people with fixed ideas about how Adise's life should look, and no explanation she could produce was ever going to change ideas that had nothing to do with her actual reasoning and everything to do with their own fears, expectations, and unexamined beliefs about the world. One evening, after a particularly draining phone call in which she had spent 45 minutes explaining a career decision to a mother who had spent 45 minutes not listening, Adise sat with a realization that arrived not as a thunderbolt but as an exhausted whisper. I have been auditioning for a role in my own life. She had been seeking permission, from people who were not qualified to grant it, to live the life she had already chosen. She had been treating her own decisions as provisional, as subject to review, as requiring external ratification before they could be fully owned and fully lived. And the permission was never going to come. Not because her choices were wrong. But because no one can give you permission to be yourself. That permission is yours to take. It was always yours to take. Adise stopped explaining herself to her family that year. Not dramatically. Not with a speech or a declaration or a family meeting where she announced her new policy. She simply stopped. Answered questions with brief, warm, non-defensive responses. Made her decisions without bringing them to the tribunal. Lived her life without submitting it for approval. The discomfort was significant at first. Because when you stop explaining yourself to people who have come to expect your explanations, they notice. And their noticing is uncomfortable. They may push harder for the justification they are accustomed to receiving. They may interpret your silence as anger. They may escalate the pressure. But here is what Adise discovered on the other side of that discomfort. Her family's opinions of her choices did not, in fact, have the power she had always granted them. They were not the gatekeepers of her life. They were people, flawed, limited, loving in their own complicated way, whose understanding of her choices was simply not a prerequisite for those choices to be valid. She did not need to be understood in order to be right. She did not need to be approved of in order to move forward. She did not need their permission. She never had. Here is a truth that will feel uncomfortable before it feels liberating. Most of the time, when you explain yourself, you are not doing it for the other person. You are doing it for yourself. You are doing it to manage your own anxiety about their disapproval. To quiet the inner voice that has been conditioned to need consensus before it feels safe. To reduce the discomfort of existing in a space where someone might misunderstand you, might judge you, might think less of you than you think of yourself. The explanation is not really communication. It is self-soothing dressed up as transparency. And once you see that, once you genuinely understand that the compulsion to explain is often more about your discomfort than their understanding, something shifts. Because you realize that the solution is not finding better words. The solution is developing a higher tolerance for being misunderstood. This is one of the most important emotional skills a human being can develop. And it is one of the least discussed. The capacity to stand in the presence of someone's disapproval, to know that they have misread you, misjudged you, formed an opinion of your choices that does not match your own understanding of them, and to feel that discomfort fully, without immediately reaching for the words that will make it go away. To let the silence be there. To let the misunderstanding exist. To trust, in the most grounded, secure, philosophically rooted way, that your life does not require their understanding in order to be valid. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private journals that stopped me completely the first time I read it. It never ceases to amaze me, we all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. This is the paradox at the center of the over-explanation compulsion. We love ourselves. We believe in our choices. We know, in our quietest and most honest moments, that what we are doing makes sense for the life we are trying to build. And yet, the moment someone raises an eyebrow, we abandon our own certainty and reach frantically for their approval instead. We outsource the authority over our own lives to people who are not living them. And then we wonder why we feel so far from ourselves. There is an old Stoic practice called the view from above. Marcus Aurelius returned to it repeatedly in his meditations, the practice of mentally stepping back from the immediate situation and seeing it from a vast, elevated perspective. From a height at which the petty urgencies of the moment reveal themselves for what they are. Apply this practice to the compulsion to explain yourself. Step back. Rise above the immediate discomfort of the moment, the raised eyebrow, the pointed question, the silence that seems to demand filling, and ask yourself from that elevated vantage point. In 5 years, will their understanding of this decision matter? In 10 years, will the approval I am currently chasing have any bearing on the quality of my life? On the last day of my life, will I look back and feel that the hours I spent explaining myself to people who were never listening were hours well spent? The answer, almost always, is no. And from that perspective, the urgency dissolves. The compulsion quiets. The silence that felt so threatening reveals itself as simply, silence. Neutral. Manageable. Far less dangerous than the accumulated cost of a lifetime spent talking into walls. We have covered the foundation of something genuinely transformative in this first part. We have looked honestly at why we explain ourselves, and discovered that the root is not communication but anxiety. Not transparency but the need for approval. Not honesty but a childhood survival strategy applied, long past its usefulness, to adult situations that do not require it. We have met Samuel, whose over-explanation undermined the very authority his brilliance deserved. And Adiz, who spent 38 years auditioning for a role in her own life before she finally took the stage without waiting for the audience's permission. And we have sat with the uncomfortable, liberating truth that Marcus Aurelius articulated 2,000 years ago and that remains as devastatingly accurate today as the moment he wrote it. But we are only halfway through. What you actually do with the silence. How you stand in someone's misunderstanding without it becoming unbearable. How you develop the specific, practical, daily habits of a person who has learned to keep their mouth shut, not out of cowardice, not out of coldness, but out of the deep and settled confidence of someone who no longer needs the world's permission to be exactly who they are. There is a kind of power that most people never discover. Not the power of the loudest voice in the room. Not the power of the most persuasive argument or the most carefully constructed explanation. Not the power of someone who has finally found the perfect words to make everyone understand. The power of someone who has decided they no longer need to. That power is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It doesn't reach outward looking for validation or consensus or the relieving warmth of someone else's approval. It simply is. And the people who carry it move through the world differently. You can feel it when you encounter them. Something about the way they hold themselves. The way they respond to challenge, or more accurately, the way they don't respond. The way their sense of self remains entirely intact regardless of whether the room agrees with them. These people are not cold. They are not arrogant. They are not indifferent to the people around them. They are simply settled. Settled in themselves. In their choices. In their right to live their lives without submitting every decision for external review. And in part 2, that settledness is exactly what we are going to build. Not as a concept. As a practice. As something you can begin developing today, in the ordinary moments of your ordinary life, until it becomes not something you do, but something you fundamentally are. The first thing that needs to be built is what I want to call an inner conviction that stands without witnesses. Most people's sense of certainty about their own decisions is surprisingly fragile. It feels solid, right up until the moment someone questions it. And then, almost immediately, the cracks appear. The doubt surfaces. The inner voice that was saying this is right, this is mine, this is the direction I have chosen suddenly becomes much quieter than the external voice that is raising questions. And that fragility, that dependence on external confirmation to maintain internal certainty, is the engine of the over-explanation compulsion. Because when your conviction needs witnesses to stay standing, you will spend your life gathering them. A woman named Miriam had built a small business from nothing. 3 years of early mornings and late nights and decisions made with incomplete information and the particular kind of courage it takes to keep going when the results are not yet visible. She had built something real. Something she was genuinely proud of. But every time someone in her life expressed doubt, every time a family member questioned whether it was sustainable, every time a friend subtly suggested she might want a backup plan, every time a colleague raised an eyebrow at her unconventional approach, Miriam would spend hours explaining the numbers, the strategy, the long-term vision, the reasoning behind each decision, the evidence that she knew what she was doing. And every time, without exception, she felt worse after the explanation than before it. Because the explanation was not producing what she needed. It was not producing the deep, settled, unshakable certainty that her choices were right. It was producing momentary relief at best, and an increasingly uncomfortable awareness, at worst, that her confidence in her own work was somehow dependent on other people's understanding of it. One evening, her mentor, a woman who had built and sold 2 businesses and carried herself with the specific quiet authority of someone who had long since stopped needing the room's agreement, said something that landed differently than anything Miriam had heard before. She said, "Miriam, the business doesn't become real when they understand it. It became real the moment you committed to it. Stop explaining the building to people who aren't going to live in it. Stop explaining the building to people who aren't going to live in it. Your life is the building. Your choices, your direction, your values, your vision for what you are constructing, these belong to you. The people you keep explaining them to are not going to live in them. Their understanding of the blueprint does not determine whether the structure stands. Only your commitment does. Build your inner conviction until it can stand without witnesses. Until the presence or absence of someone else's understanding does not alter, even slightly, the clarity and certainty with which you hold your own direction. This is not built overnight. It is built in exactly the moments that feel most uncomfortable, the moments when someone questions you and every conditioned instinct reaches for the explanation, and you choose, instead, to simply stand in your own knowing. Each time you do that, each time you let the question hang in the air without rushing to fill it, you add a layer of genuine, unwitnessed, internally generated certainty that no amount of explaining could ever produce. The second thing to build is the discipline of the considered response. Because keeping your mouth shut does not mean becoming a person of no words. It does not mean silence in every situation. It does not mean swallowing things that genuinely need to be said or becoming someone who withholds honest communication in the name of a misunderstood philosophy of restraint. It means becoming someone who speaks with intention. There is a profound difference between the words of someone who is speaking to discharge anxiety, to manage discomfort, to seek approval, to fill a silence that has become unbearable, and the words of someone who has chosen, deliberately and consciously, that this particular moment calls for this particular response. The first kind of speaking is reactive. It happens to you. It emerges from the nervous system before the mind has had a chance to weigh in. The second kind of speaking is chosen. It comes from a person who has sat in the discomfort, assessed the situation honestly, and decided, not out of reflex but out of genuine deliberation, what, if anything, needs to be said. A man named Kofi had spent years in a professional environment where his ideas were regularly challenged, sometimes productively, sometimes in ways that were less about genuine inquiry and more about the particular organizational politics of people who felt threatened by his competence. For a long time, Kofi responded to every challenge with a detailed defense of his position. He was articulate. He was thorough. He was exhausting himself and, without realizing it, training the people around him to challenge him specifically because his defenses were so elaborate and so energetically available. Then he began to practice something different. When challenged, instead of immediately producing the explanation his nervous system was reaching for, he paused. Sometimes for several seconds. Sometimes long enough that the other person grew visibly uncomfortable in the silence. And then, from that settled, deliberate place, he would respond with the minimum number of words the situation actually required. Not a paragraph. A sentence. Sometimes half a sentence. I'm confident in this direction. I've considered that. I'm moving forward. That's a fair question. I've thought it through. And then, silence. No elaboration. No justification. No detailed accounting of every factor he had weighed. Just the quiet, undefended confidence of someone who had made a decision and was standing in it. The effect on the room was remarkable. And it took him a while to understand why. Because the elaboration, the detailed, anxious, thoroughgoing explanation, had been communicating uncertainty. It had been saying, between every line, I am not entirely sure this is right, and I need you to agree with me in order to feel certain. The brevity communicated something entirely different. It communicated, I have thought about this. I am not asking for your agreement. This is simply where I stand. And people, almost universally, respond differently to those two signals. They push against uncertainty. They lean into confidence. Not because they are malicious. But because human beings are social animals who take cues from each other constantly. When you signal that your position is negotiable, that the right words from them could move you, they negotiate. When you signal that your position is considered and held, they may not always agree, but they stop pushing. The considered response is a skill. And like all skills, it is built through practice. Through the deliberate, repeated choice to pause before speaking. To ask yourself, honestly, whether the words you are about to produce are serving the situation, or serving your anxiety about the situation. And to speak only what the situation actually requires. The third thing to build is a completely new relationship with being misunderstood. This is the deepest work. And it is the work that makes everything else sustainable. Because the reason most people cannot stop explaining themselves, even when they know intellectually that the explanation isn't working, is that being misunderstood is genuinely, physically, viscerally uncomfortable. It triggers something ancient in the nervous system. Something that goes back to the earliest human communities where being misunderstood by the group had real, tangible, survival-level consequences. Being cast out. Being excluded. Being seen as other. That ancient alarm system does not know that the person raising an eyebrow at your career choice is not a threat to your survival. It responds to social disapproval with the same urgency it would respond to genuine danger. And so the explanation, the rush to restore understanding, to re-establish connection, to make sure the other person sees you correctly, is not just a communication habit. It is a nervous system response. Which means that building a new relationship with being misunderstood is not just a matter of deciding to behave differently. It requires the slower, more patient work of actually retraining the nervous system. Of sitting in the discomfort of misunderstanding long enough that the alarm system learns, gradually and through repeated experience, that this particular discomfort is not dangerous. That you can be misunderstood, and survive. Fully. Intact. With your life and your choices and your sense of self entirely uncompromised. Let me tell you about a moment that a man named Elijah described as the turning point in his relationship with other people's opinions. Elijah had made a significant life decision, left a stable career to pursue something that mattered more to him, and his immediate circle responded with a mixture of concern, skepticism, and the particular kind of unsolicited advice that comes from people who are projecting their own fears onto your choices. His instinct was to explain. To defend. To produce enough evidence of his reasoning that the concern would dissolve and the skepticism would convert into support. Instead, for the first time in his life, he tried something different. He let it be. He let them be concerned. He let them be skeptical. He let the conversations end without resolution, without consensus, without the satisfying closure of having been understood. And he went home. And he sat with the discomfort. And he did not reach for his phone to text someone who would validate him. He did not rehearse better arguments in his head. He did not draft the explanation he would give the next time the subject came up. He just sat with it. And somewhere in that sitting, somewhere in the honest, unmedicated experience of being misunderstood by people he cared about, something unexpected happened. He realized he was okay. Not comfortable. Not indifferent. Not unaffected. But okay. Fundamentally, structurally, at the level that actually matters, okay. And that realization, that direct, experiential, body-level understanding that misunderstanding does not destroy you, was worth more than any explanation he could have produced. Because you cannot think your way to a high tolerance for discomfort. You can only develop it by tolerating discomfort. By staying in the room with it long enough to discover that it is survivable. Every time you let yourself be misunderstood without reaching for the explanation, you are building that tolerance. You are teaching your nervous system something it may have never been taught. You are safe here. Even in the silence. Even in the misunderstanding. Even without their approval. You are safe. There is a quality that the most self-possessed people in history have shared, across cultures, across centuries, across every conceivable kind of circumstance. It is not intelligence. History is full of brilliant people who never found peace. It is not success. History is equally full of accomplished people who remained, despite every achievement, desperately dependent on other people's validation. The quality these people shared was something simpler and rarer than either of those things. It was self-knowledge. A clear, honest, non-defensive understanding of who they were, what they valued, why they made the choices they made, held internally, quietly, without the need for external confirmation. Socrates, who was arguably the most influential thinker in the history of Western philosophy, was also a man who was deeply, persistently, cheerfully misunderstood by almost everyone around him. He was strange by the standards of his time. His methods were unconventional. His questions were uncomfortable. His refusal to simply tell people what they wanted to hear made him genuinely unpopular in many circles. And yet he carried himself with a quality that his contemporaries could not quite name but could absolutely feel. He knew himself. Not perfectly. Not arrogantly. But deeply and honestly enough that other people's misunderstanding of him did not alter the understanding he had of himself. He famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living. But the implication, the one that lives between the lines of everything he said and did, is equally powerful. The examined life does not require other people's examination to be valid. Know yourself. Not as a performance for anyone else. Not to produce a version of yourself that will finally be understood and approved of by everyone around you. Know yourself for yourself. In your own quiet moments. In your most honest internal conversations. In the space between who you are and who the world thinks you are, and in the settled, secure, deeply personal knowledge that those two things do not need to match in order for you to be okay. A brief story before we close. There was once a judge, known throughout his region for the quality of his decisions and the quiet authority of his presence in the courtroom. People who appeared before him often remarked afterward that there was something unusual about him. Something that made even the most aggressive attorneys in the room lower their volume slightly, slow their arguments slightly, become, without quite knowing why, more measured. Someone eventually asked him what his secret was. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "I stopped trying to convince people a long time ago. I just make the decision I believe is right. And I let the decision speak. I stopped trying to convince people. I just let the decision speak." Your life is a decision. Every choice you make, every direction you take, every morning you wake up and live according to your own values rather than someone else's expectations, is a decision that speaks. It speaks without words. It speaks in the quality of your work, the steadiness of your presence, the consistency of your character over time. And it speaks far more convincingly, far more powerfully, far more permanently, than any explanation you could produce. Let it speak. Close your mouth. Stand in your choices. Trust the life you are building to say, over time, everything that needs to be said. You came into this conversation, perhaps, carrying the weight of 100 unfinished explanations. 100 conversations where you gave too much of yourself trying to be understood by people who were not trying to understand you. 100 moments where you made yourself smaller, more apologetic, more justifying, than the life you are living deserves. You can put that weight down now. Not because explanation is never appropriate. Not because communication doesn't matter. Not because the people in your life are not worth honest, genuine, open conversation when honest, genuine, open conversation is what the moment calls for. But because your life, your actual, real, irreplaceable, one-time only life, does not need a defense. It needs a builder. Someone who wakes up every morning and makes the next decision with clarity and commitment and the quiet confidence of a person who has stopped auditioning for other people's approval and started simply living. That person is available to you. They are, in fact, who you already are, underneath the explaining, underneath the justifying, underneath the exhausting performance of seeking consensus from people who were never the audience that mattered. Keep your mouth shut. Not out of fear. Not out of coldness. Not because you have nothing to say. But because you have finally understood something that changes everything. The life you are building speaks louder than any words you could use to defend it. Let it speak. Every week, without exception, we come here and have the conversations that go beneath the surface. The honest ones. The ones that ask something of you. The ones that don't just make you feel good for a few minutes but genuinely shift something in the way you understand yourself and the way you move through the world.